The Germans called it Mini Stalingrad, not as a metaphor, as a precise description of what was happening inside a small Russian railway town in the first 2 weeks of July 1943. Men were fighting through the rooms of a railway station with entrenching tools. Soviet sappers were crawling through rubble on their hands and knees to reach 65-ton armoured vehicles that no anti-tank gun could destroy, climbing onto the hull in full view of German infantry, placing explosive charges directly against the engine deck, because that was the only way to kill them. German crews inside those vehicles and sealed in, unable to see what was on top of them, unable to depress their main gun low enough to engage men at their own tracks, were firing their personal weapons through vision ports at shapes moving through the dust 3 meters away. In the railway station itself, the front line ran through the middle of the building. Men on both sides were using the same walls as cover from the same directions. Positions changed hands not once a day but multiple times within a single afternoon. A Soviet 203mm howitzer battery was called in to destroy a single armoured vehicle at point-blank range because nothing else available could kill it. 10 Tigers were destroyed around a single town in a single afternoon engagement. The ground north of Ponyri, flat and featureless except for one low hill, was fought over so many times and at such cost that both sides eventually stopped trying to hold the crest in strength and instead contested the forward slopes simply for the observation they provided. Observation cost hundreds of men per day. This was Ponyri, July 1943. A railway junction in central Russia, a tractor depot, a school, a water tower. A town of no particular significance before the war that became in 8 days one of the most violently contested pieces of ground on the Eastern Front. Paul Carrel, the German military historian who researched this battle from German primary sources in the 1960s, called it the Stalingrad of the Kursk salient. The men who were there used the shorter name, Mini Stalingrad. It was not given lightly. To understand how a railway junction became this, you have to understand what the German Ninth Army was trying to do, what weapon it brought to do it, and why that weapon, the most powerful armoured vehicle on the Eastern Front in July 1943, was ultimately destroyed not by Soviet tanks or anti-tank guns, but by infantry with explosive charges and the willingness to climb onto a moving 65-ton machine in the middle of a firefight. Walter Model commanded the German Ninth Army, the force tasked with driving south from the Ural region to meet the SS Panzer Corps coming north from Belgorod. If both arms of the pincer closed, the Soviet forces inside the Kursk salient would be encircled and destroyed. The plan followed the same operational logic that had produced the great encirclements of 1941, Minsk, Kiev, Vyazma, where hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers were trapped in days. Citadel, if it worked, would repeat that pattern at a moment when Germany urgently needed to stabilise the Eastern Front and demonstrate it could still dictate the terms of the war. Model had doubts from the beginning. In the spring of 1943, while Hitler and the OKW debated whether to proceed with Citadel, Model went to Hitler personally and brought aerial photographs of the Soviet defensive preparations inside the salient. What those photographs showed was not a defensive line, it was a defensive system, belt after belt of trenches, minefields, anti-tank gun positions, and artillery pre-registered on every likely axis of advance. Model argued that the Soviets knew the attack was coming, that every week of delay made the defences stronger, and that the plan as written was running out of time. He was not wrong on any of those points. Hitler approved the operation anyway, then delayed it further to wait for new armoured vehicles, the Panthers for the south, and for Model's northern attack, a weapon the German High Command had placed enormous faith in, the Ferdinand. There was also a second concern Model raised that received less attention in the post-war literature. North of the Ninth Army's attack front, along the Ural salient, the German 2nd Panzer Army was holding a long and thinly stretched defensive line. Model knew it. He had flagged it. If the Soviets chose to strike that line while the Ninth Army was committed deep in the Kursk salient, the consequences would be severe. He was raising the possibility of his own rear being cut off before the offensive had even begun. That concern would prove to be entirely correct, but before it became relevant, there was Ponyri to get through first. The story of the Ferdinand begins not with tactical necessity, but with industrial politics. When the German army ran a competition in 1942 to select a new heavy tank, 2 companies submitted prototypes: Henschel, whose design was accepted and became the Tiger one, and Porsche, whose design was rejected. Ferdinand Porsche had been so confident his vehicle would win that he had already begun production on the hull. 91 hulls sat in the factory with nowhere to go. The solution was conversion. The Porsche hulls were fitted with a fixed armoured casemate housing one of the most powerful anti-tank guns in existence, the 88mm PaK 43/2L71, significantly more powerful than the 88 fitted to the Tiger. Two heavy tank destroyer battalions were formed around these vehicles, the 653rd and the 654th. Both were assigned to Model's 9th Army for Citadel, giving the northern sector the entire global inventory of Ferdinand's in existence. 89 vehicles between two battalions grouped under Heavy Panzerjäger Regiment 656. On paper, the Ferdinand was a decisive weapon. At long range, it was essentially invulnerable and unstoppable. Its frontal armour was 200mm thick. No Soviet anti-tank gun in the summer of 1943 could penetrate it from the front at normal combat range. Its 88 could destroy T-34s and KVs at distances where they could not effectively shoot back. A post-war assessment of the vehicles the Soviets captured or inspected after the battle found that, of 21 Ferdinands examined in detail, only one had been destroyed by a Soviet tank gun. One, a shell that struck the side armour at close range and ignited the fuel tank. Against the frontal armour, Soviet tank guns had been essentially useless. The vehicle did exactly what it was designed to do in the conditions it was designed for. The problem was the Ponyri was never those conditions. The Ferdinand carried no hull machine gun. The fixed casemate gave the main gun very limited traverse, roughly 10 degrees either side of the centre line. Against infantry at close range, a Ferdinand was almost defenceless. The crew could not bring the main gun to bear on men directly alongside the hull, had nothing to sweep the vehicle's sides with, and could not open their hatches without immediately exposing themselves. The Ferdinand had been built to kill tanks at long range. At Ponyri, it was going to be fighting in rubble-filled streets where the ranges were measured in metres, not kilometres, and where the men it could not kill were the men who were going to kill it. Heinz Guderian, Inspector General of Panzer Troops, inspected the 653rd Battalion during pre-offensive exercises and pressed for hull machine guns to be installed before the attack. There was no time. The vehicles went into battle as they were. The ground between Model's start line and Ponyri had not been left to chance. Rokossovsky's central front had been building its defences since February 1943, and the Ponyri sector had received particular attention. Konstantin Rokossovsky commanded the central front from headquarters that understood exactly what was coming, and had spent months preparing to receive it. Polish by birth, arrested during Stalin's Great Purge in 1937, Rokossovsky had spent 3 years in before being released in 1940. What he brought to the defence of the northern salient was a precise, disciplined approach to reserve management that would prove to be one of the decisive factors of the entire Kursk battle. In April 1943, Rokossovsky ordered the civilian population evacuated from the frontal zone to a depth of 25 kilometres. Ponyri was emptied. Every house, every building, every structure in the town was then adapted for military use. The town did not need to be protected because people lived in it. It needed to be used because its position across the main rail line from Orel to Kursk made it the key to the entire northern approach. Rokossovsky's engineers converted it accordingly. The railway station building was fortified with firing ports cut through its walls. The MTS, the machine tractor station, a large agricultural machinery depot on the northern edge of town, was turned into an armoured strongpoint with anti-tank guns sighted to cover every approach. The school building on the southern side was fortified and connected to a network of trenches. The water tower served as an observation post commanding the flat ground north of the town. Between and behind these positions ran interlocking trench lines, communications trenches and covered passages that allowed defenders to move under fire between strongpoints. Every street in Ponyri had been mined. Every open approach north of the town was covered by pre-registered artillery concentrations. The Soviets had created a battlefield specifically calibrated to deny the Germans everything their armoured strength needed: space, visibility, and range. The division assigned to hold Ponyri was the 307th Rifle Division, commanded by General M.A. Yenshin, part of General Pukov's 13th Army, at the centre of Rokossovsky's front. The 307th was not placed in the line and left to manage alone. Soviet planners massed behind it the largest concentration of artillery ever allocated in support of a single infantry division during the entire war: 15 artillery regiments, a heavy howitzer brigade, 2 anti-tank artillery brigades, the 3rd Tank Corps, the 129th Separate Tank Brigade, and the 27th Separate Tank Regiment, many of their vehicles dug in hull down with only their turrets showing above the earth. Behind the 307th, there were more lines, more reserves, more artillery. When the German Ninth Army hit Jenshin's sector, it was not hitting an infantry division, it was hitting an infantry division backed by a combined arms fortress that Rokossovski had spent months building specifically to stop what was coming. The German attack opened in the early hours of July 5th. The 41st Panzer Corps, commanded by General Joseph Harp, was assigned the sector containing Ponyri. Its task was to drive along the Kursk rail line, penetrate the high ground where Ponyri sat, and push south toward Kursk. The corps comprised the 292nd Infantry Division, the 86th Infantry Division, the 18th Panzer Division, and the 78th Assault Division. The Ferdinand battalions of Regiment 656 were attached as its armoured fist. The Soviets knew the timing. A captured German sapper in the hours before the attack had given up the precise schedule of Model's artillery preparation. Rokossovski ordered his own guns to fire first. In the darkness before dawn, thousands of Soviet artillery pieces opened on the German assembly areas and approach routes. German units moving into their jump-off positions were caught in the open. The preemptive barrage disrupted the German schedule and disordered units that had not yet fully deployed. Model's guns replied, and the attack went in. For the Ferdinand battalions, the first hours were catastrophic. The 653rd Heavy Panzerjäger Battalion had been assigned west of the railway, attacking alongside the 292nd Infantry Division. The 654th was on the eastern side. Both sectors were saturated with mines. The Germans had brought radio-controlled demolition vehicles, the Borgward B4 and the smaller Goliath, specifically to clear lanes through the minefields ahead of the assault. The system failed almost immediately. Artillery fire detonated the minefields before the lanes could be properly marked. Explosions across the field obliterated the track marks left by the Borgward vehicles, making the cleared paths invisible to the Ferdinand crews following behind. The 653rd sent 45 Ferdinands into that attack. By 1700 hours on the first day, 37 of them had been immobilized by mine damage, not destroyed by enemy fire, immobilized by mines they could not see in ground churned up by their own side's artillery. Most were later recovered and repaired, but on day one of Citadel, the most powerful tank destroyers Germany possessed had been stopped not by a weapon that could match them, but by buried explosive charges in earth that the preparatory bombardment had made unreadable. The Ninth Army's advance on July 5th penetrated between 12 and 15 kilometers into the Soviet defensive system before stalling. The 41st Corps reached the outskirts of Ponyri's defensive perimeter. It had not broken through it. That night, both sides prepared for what was coming. July 6th brought the first sustained fighting inside the Ponyri defensive complex. The 654th Battalion's Ferdinands pushed forward on the eastern side, in support of the infantry assault on the MTS and the northern approaches to the station. In open ground north of the town, the Ferdinands performed as designed. Several Soviet tanks dug in on the approaches were knocked out at distances between 1,500 and 2,000 meters. The 88mm rounds tore through their armor before the Soviet crews could close to effective return range. But as the infantry assault pushed into the town and the Ferdinands attempted to follow, the terrain changed everything. The streets of Ponyri were narrow. The rubble was already accumulating from continuous artillery fire landing on both sides. Soviet infantry who had survived the outer positions pulled back into the fortified buildings and connected trenches. And when the Ferdinands moved forward without their accompanying infantry, who were themselves taking fire from positions on either side, the tank destroyers found themselves isolated in ground where their main gun was the wrong weapon. The gun could not depress low enough to engage positions in basements directly below the muzzle. The limited traverse meant the crew could not cover both sides of a lane simultaneously. Soviet sappers moved through the rubble and closed on the vehicles from angles the main gun could not reach. With no hull machine gun, the German crews inside were reduced to firing personal weapons through vision ports at men who were using the Ferdinand's own hull as cover. Some crews fired their MG-42s down the main barrel of the 88 in attempts to create any kind of defensive fire against infantry at close range. It provided almost no protection. The men outside were too close, too dispersed, and the hull was too large to defend from inside. The MTS changed hands twice on July 6th. German infantry took it in the morning. Soviet counterattacks pushed them out by mid-afternoon, and by evening the fighting had returned to the northern edge of the structure. The railway station itself was fought over continuously. German units from the 292nd Division penetrated into the station building in the afternoon, occupying parts of the structure while Soviet defenders held others. The fighting moved room by room through the building. At certain points during the day, the front line ran through the centre of the station hall itself, with German soldiers on one side of an interior wall and Soviet soldiers on the other. Hill 253.5 sits approximately 2 kilometers north-northeast of the station, a low rise above otherwise flat terrain that provided clear observation across every German approach to the town. Whoever held it could direct artillery fire against everything moving below. Whoever did not hold it moved blind and under observed fire. The hill changed hands repeatedly over the coming days. On July 6, the 86th Infantry Division attacked it with 2 infantry battalions supported by Tigers and Ferdinands from the 653rd. The Soviets held. General Yeltsin committed his anti-tank reserve to the hill's defence, the 13th Anti-Tank Brigade, with 40 76mm guns and 20 45mm pieces moving under fire to pre-positioned sites, and called in the full weight of the Katyusha batteries behind the line. The counterattack destroyed 10 Tigers and 12 Panzer IVs. The hill stayed Soviet that day, 10 Tigers around a single low hill in a single afternoon. That figure, repeated across every day of this battle, is what mini Stalingrad meant in practice. July 7th was the day Model committed everything. Recognizing that the initial attacks had not broken through quickly enough, General Harp ordered a concentrated assault using every available asset. The 18th Panzer Division, held in Corps Reserve, was committed for the first time, attacking toward Ponyri from the north and northwest, alongside the 292nd. The 86th Division attacked Hill 253.5 from the northeast. The Ferdinand battalions were concentrated for a mass assault on the station and MTS complex. A strike group of 166 combat vehicles was assembled, including 44 Ferdinands and 45 Brummbär assault tanks. The formation's commander, Bruno Karl, structured it in the shape described in German records as a Glock, a bell. The Ferdinands formed the leading edge in 2 rows. The first contained 2 companies spaced 100 meters apart, company commanders' vehicles centered in each line. The second row held the third company at 120 to 150 meter intervals. Signal flags were attached to every Ferdinand's antenna in case radio failed. The vehicles behind the Ferdinands were Brummbärs and 75mm assault guns tasked with suppressing infantry and engineer teams, while the Ferdinands engaged the dug-in armour and anti-tank positions ahead. On open ground north of Ponyri, the formation worked. The Ferdinand's 88mm guns reached out at long range and knocked out dug-in Soviet tanks and anti-tank gun positions before the Soviet guns could return effective fire. For several hours on July 7th, the outer defensive line north of the town cracked. The Germans pushed into the northern part of Ponyri. By midday, they held half of it, including the northern edge of the station and parts of the MTS. Yeltsin responded immediately. He transferred every available anti-tank gun to the station sector and called in the full weight of the massed artillery behind the town. Soviet Il-2 ground attack aircraft began working the German approach routes. Then came the moment that demonstrated more clearly than anything else what this battle was doing to the Ferdinand. A single 203mm B4 howitzer battery was called in against a Ferdinand that had pushed forward of the infantry screen. The 203mm round that hit it did what no Soviet tank gun could do. The concussive force of a shell that weighed nearly 100 kilograms collapsed the hull plating and killed the crew. The frontal armour was not penetrated. It did not need to be. The round simply overwhelmed the structure behind it. It was a rare kill. Heavy howitzers were not standard anti-tank weapons and were not available in this role routinely, but it demonstrated something important. The Ferdinand was not invincible. It was merely proof against the weapons designed to fight it. The weapons not designed to fight it could still destroy it if you were creative enough to deploy them. By late afternoon on July 7th, Soviet counterattacks had pushed the Germans back out of the northern half of Ponyri. Hill 253.5 changed hands again. The 86th Division had taken it in the early morning. The 307th retook it by mid-afternoon with tank support from the 3rd Tank Corps. German records for that single-day list, attacks and counterattacks, at 0800, at 1000, at 1530 and at 1900 hours. The 1900 attack came in with an infantry regiment supported by 60 tanks. Yeltsin's anti-tank line stopped it. When the fighting subsided after dark, the Germans held approximately the same ground they had held at dawn, and the cost of the day had been paid in men and machines that could not be easily replaced. The 307th Rifle Division's records for the period July 5th to July 7th describe repelling combined attacks by elements of the 292nd Infantry Division, the 86th Infantry Division and the 78th Assault Division supported by an aggregate of 170 tanks. 3 days of fighting, 1 Russian Rifle Division, 170 German tanks thrown against it. The division held because it was not fighting alone, and because Rokossovsky was managing his reserves with a discipline that Harp and Model were not seeing matched on their side of the line. Where the Germans were committing their reserve divisions, the 12th Panzer and the 10th Panzer Grenadier, which Model had originally planned to hold back for exploitation, to plug crisis points in the front, Rokossovsky was feeding fresh units into the Ponyri sector from the deep reserves of the Central Front. The 4th Guards Airborne Division arrived to reinforce the eastern approaches. Additional tank brigades were dug in south of the town to serve as a blocking line behind the station. What the Germans were attacking was not diminishing, it was being rebuilt in front of them every night. The Ferdinand losses were accumulating in ways the raw numbers did not immediately reveal. The 653rd Battalion, which had started Citadel with 45 vehicles, had 0 Ferdinands operational by July 8th. None. The battalion stood down for a full recovery day on July 8th to attempt repairs and return vehicles to service. Some came back, many did not. The problem was not only combat damage, the Ferdinand was a 65-ton vehicle sitting on running gear designed for a tank that was never built. The mechanical stress of operating in mined, rubble-strewn terrain was extreme. Vehicles that survived without being destroyed were breaking down in the repair parks, and a chronic shortage of spare parts meant that the maintenance companies could not process the backlog. On any given day during the Ponyri fighting, the number of Ferdinands available for combat was in the single digits. The fighting itself, meanwhile, was moving deeper into a rhythm that ground both sides down systematically. The pattern was consistent across July 8th, 9th and 10th. At first light, German infantry, supported by whatever armour could be assembled, would push into the northern sectors of the town. They would gain ground in the initial assault, sometimes reaching the station, sometimes the MTS, sometimes pushing toward the school and the water tower. Soviet defenders fell back into the fortified buildings, used the rubble for cover, and held their fire until the attackers were inside the defensive perimeter. Then the artillery would come down, not on the German positions, which were now intermingled with Soviet defenders, but on the approach routes behind them, cutting the assaulting units off from reinforcement and resupply. The units inside the town would then be hit by Soviet reserves fed into the battle through the communication trench network, men who emerged from covered passages in the rear of positions the Germans had just taken and attacked them from directions they had not defended, because they had not known the passages existed. The account of this fighting in the 9th Army's war diary does not use the language of German operational doctrine. It describes something without precedent in the Army's experience. The phrase that appears in the diary is precise and worth quoting directly. A new type of mobile attrition battle. The phrase is significant because German operational thinking had no category for it. Bewegungskrieg, war of movement, was the framework that German commanders understood. Speed of decision, penetration, exploitation, collapse of cohesion. What Ponyri was producing was the opposite of every one of those principles. Penetration happened and was immediately sealed. Speed produced isolation. Cohesion on the German side was the thing being collapsed, not on the Soviet side. On July 9th, Harp ordered the largest single armoured concentration of the entire northern battle for one final attempt to break through Ponyri completely. The 654th Battalion's remaining Ferdinands were grouped with the 505th Heavy Tank Battalion's Tigers and the Brumbeer assault guns of the 216th Battalion for a coordinated assault on the station complex from multiple directions simultaneously. The attack achieved initial penetration into several parts of the town. By the afternoon of July 9th, the Germans had secured most of the northern half of Ponyri and were fighting within 100 meters of the water tower. It was the deepest penetration of the entire battle. Yenshin called in everything. The massed artillery behind the town fired continuously. The 2nd Guards Mortar Brigade's Katyusha batteries put rockets down on the German approach routes in rolling salvos. Soviet anti-tank gun crews who had been positioned in the buildings on either side of the German penetration opened fire from the flanks at ranges where it was impossible to miss. The Ferdinand crews who had pushed forward found themselves in the same situation as every previous day, stationary in narrow ground, unable to use their main armament against the infantry closing on them from 3 sides. Waiting for the sappers they could hear on the hull above them and could not reach. By the end of July 9th, the 653rd Battalion's situation report to 2nd Panzer Army Headquarters was blunt. The battalion had 54 Ferdinands on its books. 25 were operational. The remaining 29 were in various states of repair, damage, or mechanical failure. The battalion commander, Major Heinrich Steinwachs, reported that the operational vehicles were on their last legs. He recommended their withdrawal from the line entirely, and suggested forming small groups 5 to 8 kilometers behind the front as a mobile reserve, to be fed vehicles as the maintenance company could return them to service. The weapon that had been presented as the instrument that would crack the Soviet defense was being recommended for withdrawal from frontline combat after 4 days of fighting. The assault on Ponyri was not called off on July 9th. It continued through July 10th with diminishing resources and no change in outcome. Hill 253.5 was taken and retaken again. The station building was fought through again. The MTS changed hands again. The figures in the divisional returns told the story that the maps could not adequately convey. German rifle companies that had gone into Citadel with 100 men were now fielding 20 or 30. The officers who had led them forward in the early attacks were disproportionately among the dead because the kind of fighting Ponyri required, room to room, trench to trench, building to building, demanded officers at the front. The experienced soldiers who knew how to fight in close terrain, who had been doing this since 1941, were the ones being used up. The replacements in the divisional rear areas were not reaching the companies in the line quickly enough, because no system moved men forward adequately under continuous combat conditions. On the Soviet side, the losses were also severe. The 307th Rifle Division's multiple regiments were reduced to combat groups by July 10th. Individual companies had been wiped out defending the station building. Anti-tank gun crews who had held their positions while German armour drove directly over their firing lines died at their guns because moving meant losing the position. But behind the 307th there was always another line. Behind that line there was another. And behind that there were the reserves that Rokossovsky had not yet committed. Rokossovsky's system worked not because any single unit was indestructible, but because the system itself had depth that Model's attacks could not reach. By July 11th, the battle around Ponyri had consumed the offensive capacity of the 41st Corps. The Ferdinands were operating in groups of 2 and 3 in defensive roles on the flanks, used to deal with Soviet armoured counterattacks rather than as an assault force, because there were not enough of them left to do anything else. Harp had committed his reserve divisions, Model had committed his. The 9th Army had advanced between 12 and 15 kilometres from its start line in 6 days, and faced more than 45 kilometres of prepared Soviet defensive belts that had not been touched. The rate at which ground had been gained and the rate at which men and machines were being consumed made any calculation of reaching Kursk an impossibility. Then, on the morning of July 12th, the situation changed in a way that made all of that irrelevant. At 5:10 on July 12th, 3 Soviet fronts launched Operation Kutuzov, the offensive against the Oral salient north of the 9th Army's positions that Model had flagged as a vulnerability before Citadel had even begun. The Western Front and the Bryansk Front struck the German 2nd Panzer Army along its extended and thinly held defensive line. The 11th Guards Army in particular drove through German positions with a momentum that within hours had created penetrations that threatened the entire Oral position. The 2nd Panzer Army's northern front was beginning to collapse. Model responded immediately. By 0800, the same morning that Prokhorovka was erupting in the south, the 12th Panzer Division and the 36th Infantry Division, which had been heading toward the Ponyri sector, were turned around and sent north. The Ferdinands of the 653rd Battalion, all 10 that were currently operational, were pulled out of Ponyri and sent with them. By 0900, Model had been given command of both the 9th Army and the 2nd Panzer Army to coordinate the defence of the entire Oral area. The offensive he had been running for 8 days was over, not because it had been defeated in a single climactic engagement at Ponyri itself, but because the threat to his own rear had made continuing it impossible. The concern he had raised before Citadel began had materialised exactly as he had described. The 9th Army's gains of the previous 8 days began to be surrendered almost immediately. On July 18th, the army began pulling back toward its start line. By July 23rd, the forces that had launched Citadel from the north were essentially back where they had started, their gains of the previous 2.5 weeks given up in a matter of days. Operation Kutuzov continued for another month, ultimately collapsing the Oral salient entirely and killing or wounding 86,000 German soldiers in the process. The Ferdinands that had been sent north to help defend against Kutuzov found, in the defensive role they were now being used for, the Steinwachs had been right about their value. A small group of Ferdinands fighting defensively from prepared positions at long range was exactly what the vehicle had been designed for. On July 17th, Hauptmann Rolf Henning's Kampfgruppe, fighting north of the Ponyri sector against the Kutuzov offensive, destroyed 22 Soviet tanks in a single engagement. Lieutenant Hermann Feldheim personally accounted for 11 of them. Some of those kills were recorded at ranges exceeding 2,500 meters. Against Soviet armour in the open at long range, the Ferdinand was still everything it had been promised to be. The problem had never been the weapon in the right conditions. The problem had been Ponyri. The final accounting for the Ferdinand battalions across the entire July 1943 fighting was as follows. The 653rd and 654th began Citadel with 89 vehicles. During July, across Ponyri and the subsequent Orel defensive fighting, 39 were irreparably destroyed. Soviet specialists from the NIBT proving grounds who inspected 21 of the knocked-out vehicles in the weeks after the battle found that 10 had been destroyed by mines and explosive charges placed by infantry, 5 had been immobilized by hits to the running gear, 1 had been destroyed by a direct hit from the 203mm B4 howitzer, 1 had been killed by a Soviet tank gun penetrating the side armour, the rest had been recovered or abandoned due to mechanical failure. Against the frontal armour across the entire battle, Soviet tank guns had achieved 1 kill. The 653rd Battalion's full combat record for the period July 5th to July 27th, drawn from German Federal Archives records, showed 320 tanks and self-propelled guns claimed destroyed, along with large numbers of anti-tank guns and motor vehicles, for the loss of 24 men killed, 126 wounded, and 13 vehicles permanently destroyed. Those numbers represent a genuine tactical achievement. The vehicle killed what it was aimed at. The kill ratio was real, but 320 Soviet armoured vehicles destroyed in the northern sector of Kursk did not produce a breakthrough at Ponyri. The station was still Soviet. Hill 253.5 was still Soviet. The road to Kursk was still blocked. The tactical success of the Ferdinand at long range was irrelevant to the outcome because the outcome was decided in the rubble of a Russian town at ranges where the Ferdinand's tactical success could not function. The 654th Battalion handed its remaining vehicles to the 653rd at the end of August and left for Germany to re-equip with Panther tanks. The surviving Ferdinands were rebuilt over the winter of 1943 with hull machine guns finally installed, the modification Guderian had requested before Citadel and been told there was no time for. Redesignated Elephant, 11 of them were sent to Italy, where the 653rd Battalion's 1st Company fought at Anzio in early 1944. Most were eventually abandoned or destroyed as the Italian campaign contracted. Ponyri was recaptured by advancing Soviet forces on July 18th without a final battle. The Germans simply left. The 307th Rifle Division, or what remained of it, watched them withdraw. Jensen's division had held the town through 8 days of continuous attack by multiple German divisions supported by the entire inventory of the most powerful tank destroyers Germany had ever built. It had done so because Rokossovsky had built a system around it that the Germans could not break regardless of how much force was applied to any single point. Every penetration was sealed. Every breakthrough was counterattacked. Every day the German assault force was smaller than the day before. Every night the Soviet defense was replenished. The Ninth Army's War Diary entry closing the Ponyri phase of the battle described the fighting in a passage that served as an inadvertent summary of what the battle had demonstrated. The Soviet defensive system, it noted, had proven capable of absorbing the full strength of an attack by multiple German divisions simultaneously, and restoring its integrity faster than the attacking force could exploit any local success. The implication of that observation, and that the tactical approach which had won every major German campaign since 1939 no longer worked against an enemy that had learned to build defences specifically designed to defeat it, was left to the reader to draw. Model drew it. In his assessment of the Northern Pincers' failure, he was direct. The offensive had been undertaken against a defensive system that had been constructed with specific knowledge of German methods and specific preparation to defeat them. The delays imposed by Hitler while waiting for new equipment had given the Soviets the time to build what he was now describing. He had said this before the offensive. He was saying it again after. In the years after the battle, Ponyri was rebuilt. The railway station was reconstructed on its original site. The school was rebuilt on the ground where its fortified predecessor had been fought through room by room. The MTS site was cleared. The town resumed the function it had served before the war, a distribution point for the collective farms in the surrounding area, a stop on the railway between Orel and Kursk, a place people pass through without particular reason to stop. Hill 253.5 still stands north of the town, the same low rise above the same flat ground. From a distance it barely registers as an elevation. You would not look at it twice from a passing car. There is nothing about it that suggests it was worth the casualties both sides paid to hold it across 8 days in July 1943. The Germans attacked it and took it, and lost it, and took it again and lost it again, and by the time the battle ended it was still in Soviet hands and had cost the attacking force more than it was worth by any calculation except the one that mattered, that holding it meant the Germans could not see the approaches to Ponyri without being seen first. and that meant the road to Kursk stayed closed.